My name is Dana. At my brother's wedding rehearsal dinner, my stepfather stood up to give a toast and spoke for 11 minutes straight. He talked about my brother's childhood, his Little League games, the road trip they took to Yellowstone when my brother was 12. He talked about my stepmother's potato salad recipe and how it brought the whole family together every summer. He talked about legacy and roots and what it means to raise a child you're proud of. He never said my name once. But that wasn't the part that broke something in me. The part that broke something in me happened 2 days earlier, when I found out they'd hired a professional photographer to redo the family portraits for the wedding venue display, and no one had called me. I only found out because my cousin mentioned it in passing, the way you mention the weather. "Oh, the photos turned out so nice," she said. "Your whole family looks so put together." I smiled and said that's great. And then I went to my car and sat there for 20 minutes because I didn't know what else to do with what I was feeling. I had lived in that house for 9 years. I had set that table for 1,000 dinners. I had learned to make myself small enough to fit into spaces that were never built for me, and apparently even that wasn't enough. My name is Dana. I'm 31 years old. I'm an elementary school teacher in Tucson, and until 14 months ago, I still believed that if I was patient enough, good enough, quiet enough, my stepfather would one day look at me the way he looked at my brother. I no longer believe that. This is the story of how I stopped waiting. My mother remarried when I was 9. His name was Richard. He had a son from his first marriage named Tyler, who was 7 at the time. And from the very first weekend we all spent together, I could feel the architecture of the new family being built around me rather than including me. Not cruelty, not at first. Just a kind of casual forgetfulness. Tyler's juice box in the fridge, labeled with his name. Tyler's baseball schedule on the calendar. Tyler's school photos on the refrigerator door. Mine were there too for a while. Then they weren't, and when I mentioned it once to my mother, she said, "Dana, don't make everything into a thing." So I stopped making it into a thing. Richard wasn't a bad man, which made it harder in some ways. Bad men are easier to understand. Richard was the kind of man who coached Little League and remembered everyone's coffee order and sent thank you notes after dinner parties. He just didn't remember I existed in the same way. When Tyler graduated from middle school, Richard rented out a room at their favorite Mexican restaurant and invited 20 people and gave a speech that made everyone cry. When I graduated from middle school, Richard said congrats, sport, and went back to watching the game. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was adjusting my expectations, which is what therapists tell you to do. By the time I was in high school, I had my system. I showed up. I was polite. I helped with dishes. I asked Tyler about his day even when he didn't ask about mine. I made myself useful in all the invisible ways that nobody notices until it stops. My mother worked evenings 3 nights a week, and on those nights I cooked dinner. Not because anyone asked me to, because I had figured out that contribution was the closest I was going to get to belonging. Richard never thanked me for those dinners. Not once. He ate them. He sometimes said not bad to no one in particular. And then he'd call Tyler in from the backyard and ask him about football practice and whatever I had made dissolved into the background like everything else I did in that house. I left for college in Phoenix on a Thursday morning in August. My mother hugged me for a long time at the door. Richard shook my hand. Tyler had already left for a friend's house. I drove 4 hours with my whole life in a Corolla, and I cried for the first 2, not because I was sad to leave, but because I realized I was relieved. That scared me more than anything. College was the first time I understood what it felt like to be seen. My roommate, a girl from Ohio named Priya, actually asked me questions and then waited for the answers. My professors learned my name by the second week. I joined a study group, then a hiking club, then a small community of people who made me feel like I was worth paying attention to. I called home every Sunday because my mother asked me to. Those calls were 15 minutes. I filled them with things I knew would matter to her and quietly edited out everything that mattered to me. I graduated in 3.5 years with a degree in education and a 3.8 GPA. My mother came to the ceremony. Richard did not. He had a work thing, my mother said. Tyler had a tournament. I walked across that stage in the Arizona heat and shook the dean's hand and looked out at the crowd and found my mother's face and she was smiling, and that was enough. I told myself it was enough. I got my first teaching job that fall, 3rd grade, and I loved it with a kind of ferocity that surprised me. I was good at being the person who showed up. I had been practicing my whole life. Tyler got engaged in February of last year. Her name is Cassidy, and she's perfectly nice in the way that Cassidy tends to be perfectly nice, bright smile, good at small talk, clearly more interested in the wedding than the marriage, but that's not my business. My mother called me with the news before the engagement was even announced publicly, which felt significant until I realized she had called me after calling Richard's sister, Richard's mother, and apparently two of Tyler's fraternity brothers. I said all the right things. I was genuinely happy for Tyler in the way you can be genuinely happy for someone you grew up alongside without ever quite feeling like family. I asked about the ring. I asked about the timeline. I said of course I'd come to whatever they needed me to come to, and I meant it. Even then, I meant it. The save the date arrived in March. My name was handwritten on the envelope. I noticed this because every other envelope at my mother's house, birthday cards, Christmas cards, the ones from Richard's family that arrived every year, had my name printed if it appeared at all. This one had my name in ink. I kept the envelope. I didn't know why. I just did. The months between March and June passed the way months do when you're waiting for something you can't name. I drove back to Tucson on a Friday evening the week before the wedding. The house smelled the same as it always had, citrus cleaner and Richard's coffee and something faintly floral that I had never been able to identify. My old room had been converted into a home gym. They had mentioned this when it happened 2 years ago. But walking past the closed door still landed differently than I expected. My mother was warm and busy in the way she gets around events. Lists on the counter, phone calls in the backyard, a kind of productive glow that I recognized from childhood as her best self. She hugged me and asked if I was hungry, and then immediately started telling me about the seating chart. I sat at the kitchen island and listened and smiled and felt, as I always felt in that house, slightly outside the glass. Tyler came home around 9. He clapped me on the shoulder the way men do when they're not sure what else to do with their hands. "Good to see you, Dee. You look great." He sat down and started talking to Richard about the groomsmen's schedule, and I became furniture again. Quietly, efficiently, the way I had always known how. The rehearsal dinner was Saturday evening at a wine bar Richard had rented for the occasion. Long tables, white linens, little clusters of tea lights in glass jars. Cassidy's family was there. Her parents, her 2 sisters, a grandmother who seemed delighted by everything. Richard's family was there. Tyler's friends were there. I sat near the middle of one of the tables next to my mother and a cousin named Greg, who I hadn't seen in 6 years, and who spent most of dinner telling me about his truck. Then came the toasts. Cassidy's father went first. He talked about the day she was born, and his voice cracked in a way that made everyone go quiet and then smile. Her mother followed. Then Richard stood up. He was in his element. Richard has always been in his element when all eyes are on him. Steady, warm, the kind of man rooms trust immediately. He talked about the day Tyler was born, a blizzard in January, Richard driving 40 miles on black ice. He talked about the Yellowstone trip, Tyler catching his first fish, the way the kid never complained once, even when it rained for 3 days straight. He talked about watching Tyler grow into a man he was proud to call his son. He said that word, son, the way you say a word you've been waiting your whole life to say out loud. I counted. 11 minutes. I know because I watched the second hand on the clock above the bar. He sat down. People clapped. My mother was crying in the soft, proud way she cries at things that matter to her. I looked at my hands in my lap and breathed the way you breathe when you are not going to do anything, when you are simply going to sit there and absorb the thing that has just happened and decide later what to do with it. Later that night, back at the house, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the guest room, my old room was unavailable to me now in more ways than one, and stared at the ceiling and let the memories come. They always come when you stop running from them. There was the Christmas I was 16 when Richard gave Tyler a car and gave me a gift card to Target that still had the drugstore sticker on the back. My mother had explained it away. Tyler needs a car for school. You're only 16. It makes sense. I had nodded and said thank you and put the gift card in my wallet and never used it. I still have it somewhere. Some part of me kept it as a receipt. There was the summer I was 20 when I came home for 6 weeks between semesters, and Richard had a hernia surgery, and I was the one who drove him to every post-op appointment because Tyler was traveling and my mother worked days and someone had to do it. I sat in waiting rooms for hours. I picked up prescriptions. I made soup. Richard recovered fully and beautifully, and when Tyler came home at the end of August, Richard spent an entire dinner telling him funny stories about the recovery and never once mentioned that I had been there for every appointment. I sat at that table and ate my soup and didn't say a word, and then there was my college fund. Or rather, the space where my college fund was supposed to be. My grandmother, my mother's mother, had set aside money for both me and my mother before she died. A modest amount, not life-changing, but enough for 2 years of in-state tuition if managed carefully. My mother had told me about it when I was in middle school, in the casual way you tell a child about something that seems far away. When I applied for college, I asked about it. My mother said there had been some adjustments. Some things had come up. The roof on the house needed replacing. There had been a bad year. Things happened, Dana. I had applied for scholarships and taken a part-time job and gotten through college with less help than I had expected, and I had told myself it was fine. I was fine. People get through things. It wasn't until last spring, 9 months before the wedding, when my aunt came to visit and said something offhand about how nice it was that Richard had been able to use the money to add on to the house, that I understood what had happened. The addition to the house had been built the summer before my freshman year. Tyler had had a new bedroom suite installed that same summer. The roof had been replaced 3 years before that, which would have been before the money was touched. I didn't say anything to my aunt. I smiled and said yes, the addition really is nice. And then I went to my old room that was now a gym with a Peloton in the corner, and I stood very still for a moment and felt something settle in me with a cold, specific clarity. Not rage, something quieter and more permanent than rage. I had always believed the best explanation for Richard's behavior, the way you believe in explanations when the alternative is too heavy to carry. He was overwhelmed. He had a complicated first marriage. He didn't know how to parent a girl. He did his best. These were the stories I told myself because they let me stay at the table, metaphorically and literally, without setting anything on fire. But there is a difference between a man who forgets and a man who redirects. And standing in what used to be my room, with the Peloton and the wall-mounted TV and the new carpet that smelled nothing like my childhood, I understood for the first time that I had been managed, not forgotten. There's a difference. It matters. I went back to Tucson and I thought about it for 3 weeks. I talked to my closest friend, a woman named Rosa who has known me since graduate school and who has a gift for saying exactly the right thing, at exactly the right time, at exactly the right time. She said, "Dana, what do you actually want to happen?" And I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I didn't want Richard to apologize. I had stopped believing in that possibility years ago. I didn't want to blow up the wedding or make a scene or give anyone ammunition to call me difficult, which had always been the threat hanging over me. Say too much and become the problem. I didn't want the money back, though the money was real and what happened to it was wrong. I wanted something harder to name. I wanted to stop pretending. I wanted to stop walking into rooms and making myself smaller and eating dinner in houses where no one had thought to take my photo. I wanted out. But I wanted out on my terms. The wedding was on a Saturday in June. White flowers, outdoor ceremony, the kind of Tucson evening where the light goes golden and everything looks better than it is. I wore a blue dress I had bought specifically for the occasion. I sat in the third row on the family side, next to Greg's wife, who was perfectly pleasant. The ceremony was beautiful, genuinely. Tyler cried when Cassidy walked down the aisle, which surprised me. I had never seen Tyler cry. It made him seem, briefly, like someone I might have known better under different circumstances. At the reception, I drank 1 glass of champagne and danced once with my cousin and talked to Cassidy's grandmother for 20 minutes about her years as a middle school librarian, which was genuinely one of the best conversations I'd had all weekend. I ate my chicken and watched the room and waited. The slideshow came during dessert. It always comes during dessert. 340 photos. I counted afterward because I had nothing else to do while they played. 340 photos of Tyler's life, from the blizzard birth to the engagement party. Family vacations, holidays, sports, graduations, birthday parties, Tyler and Richard fishing, Tyler and Richard at a game, Tyler at 5, at 10, at 15, at 25. I appeared in 7 of them. In 5 of those 7, I was partially cut off at the edge. In 1, I was standing behind someone taller and my face was obscured. In the last one, a Christmas photo from when I was 11, I was clearly visible, smiling in a red sweater, and I remember that Christmas because it was the year I genuinely believed things were going to be different. 7 photos, 333 without me. At the table next to mine, a little girl in a flower girl dress tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed at the screen. "Mom," she whispered, "who's that lady in the red sweater?" I heard it clearly. The mother shushed her. I looked down at my dessert plate and placed my fork very carefully beside it. I excused myself to the restroom and stood at the sink with the water running and looked at my face in the mirror for a long time. I wasn't going to cry. I had decided somewhere in the last 9 months that I was done crying in bathrooms at family events, done swallowing things in private so everyone else could stay comfortable in public. The woman in the mirror looked composed. She looked like she had already made her decision. When I came back to the table, Richard was holding court at the center of the room, laughing at something, his arm around Tyler's shoulder. My mother was watching him with that soft pride she reserves for moments that feel like proof she made the right choice. Cassidy was taking photos with her sisters. I sat down, I picked up my fork, I finished my dessert, and then I opened the notes app on my phone and I started writing. Not a speech, not a confrontation, a list. Every specific thing I could remember, dated as precisely as possible. The Target gift card, the college fund conversation, the post-op appointments that nobody mentioned, the family portraits I hadn't been called for, the slideshow, the 7 photos, the 11-minute toast in which my name never appeared. I had been making this list in my head for years without knowing it. Writing it down took 22 minutes. I sat at a wedding reception and I wrote down the shape of my own erasure, and when I was done, I looked at it and felt, for the first time in a long time, absolutely clear. I drove back to Tucson Sunday morning. I didn't say a long goodbye. I hugged my mother and told her it was a beautiful wedding, which was true. I said congratulations to Tyler and Cassidy and meant it, which was also true. I shook Richard's hand and looked at him very directly and said, "Take care of yourself," which was the only sentence I had that contained everything I was no longer going to say. 2 days later, I called my aunt, the one who had mentioned the house addition. I told her I had some questions about my grandmother's estate, just clarifying things, nothing dramatic. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Honey, I've been wondering when you were going to ask." She told me that my grandmother had left specific written instructions that the funds were to be used for my education, that she had mentioned it to my mother before she passed, that my aunt had assumed it had been handled correctly until she saw the addition going up that summer. I thanked her. I didn't ask her to do anything. I just needed to know that what I remembered was real. That night, I opened my laptop and wrote one email. I sent it to Richard. Not to Tyler, not to Cassidy, not to my mother, to Richard. The subject line was simply, "Some things I need you to know." I didn't threaten anything. I didn't demand anything. I laid out what I knew, what I remembered, what my aunt had told me, and what it had cost me to grow up feeling like a guest in my own childhood home. I told him that I had spent 22 years making myself easier to overlook, and that I was done doing that. I told him that I would not be attending future family gatherings where I was expected to smile and perform belonging. I had never been given the conditions to feel. I told him that I wasn't sending this email out of anger. I was sending it because I had spent too long letting silence do the work of honesty, and because at 31 years old, I finally understood that the people who benefit from your silence are never the ones who will thank you for keeping it. I hit send and closed my laptop and made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table and listened to the quiet of my apartment. My phone rang at 11 the next morning. Richard. I let it go to voicemail. His message was measured, careful, the voice of a man who has spent his life managing other people's perceptions of him. He said he was sorry I felt that way. He said families are complicated. He said he hoped I knew how much my mother loved me, and that he hoped I wouldn't do anything to hurt her. He said he was sure we could talk through this if I was willing to be reasonable. He didn't say I was wrong. He didn't mention my grandmother's money. He didn't say my name once in the entire message, which I noticed because of course I noticed. I didn't call back. I texted my mother directly because she deserved directness from me even if she hadn't always offered it in return. I told her I loved her and that I needed some time away from family events while I figured out what kind of relationship I was capable of having with Richard going forward. I told her this had nothing to do with Tyler or Cassidy or the wedding. I told her I was okay. I told her I hoped she would understand, and that if she wanted to talk, I was available, but I wasn't going to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. She called that evening. The conversation was hard. She cried in the way she cries when she doesn't know what to do with something. Not soft and proud, the way she cried at the rehearsal dinner, but ragged and confused and a little frightened. She said she hadn't known about the money. I believed her, mostly. She said she hadn't known about the money. I believed her, mostly. She said Richard was a good man. I said I knew he had been good to her, and that I was glad for her and that those two things could both be true at the same time. She said I was being harsh. I said I was being honest, which is different. There was a long silence. Then she said, "I love you, Dana." I said, "I love you too, Mom," and I meant it completely. A week later, my aunt called. She had spoken to a family attorney, she said, not on my behalf necessarily, but because she had been carrying her own guilt about this for a long time and she needed to understand what had actually happened. The attorney confirmed that what had been done with my grandmother's designated funds was a violation of the original written intent. Not something I needed to pursue if I didn't want to. But not nothing either. I thought about it for 4 days. I talked to Rosa, who asked the right questions without telling me what to do. I went on 3 long runs and let myself think in the open air, the way I can't think inside. I wasn't interested in a lawsuit. I wasn't interested in a family war. I wasn't even sure I was interested in the money, though I had worked 2 jobs in college and taken loans that took me 6 years to pay off while Richard's house had a new addition and Tyler had a new bedroom suite. What I was interested in was the truth being acknowledged by someone besides me. That was the thing I had never been given, not an apology, not a reversal, not a grand gesture, just a single person in that family saying, "Yes, that happened. You're right, it wasn't fair. My aunt gave me that." She said it simply. On a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in her car in a Safeway parking lot from the sound of it, while I stood in my kitchen grading spelling tests. She said, "Dana, what happened to you in that family was not okay. You were not treated equally, and you deserved better, and I should have said something a long time ago. I'm sorry I didn't." I put down the red pen I was holding. I stood very still. I had been waiting for a sentence like that for 22 years, and it was shorter than I expected. And it was enough. It was exactly enough, I cried then. Not in a bathroom at a family event, not hidden away, not in a car with the windows up. In my own kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window above the sink, standing over a stack of 3rd graders' spelling tests, crying without any particular shame about it. Some things need that. Some releases have been compressed for so long that when they finally happen they surprise you with their smallness, how ordinary and human and manageable the relief turns out to be. The months that followed were not dramatic. That's the part nobody tells you about when you imagine finally doing the thing you've been afraid to do. You imagine a seismic event, a clear before and after, something you can point to. What actually happens is quieter. The family group chat, which I'd been in for 6 years, went from something I dreaded to something I simply no longer participated in. I didn't leave it with a declaration. I muted it and eventually, gradually, stopped reading it. That was its own kind of statement. My mother and I found a new cadence. Sunday calls became bi-weekly calls, and the calls became easier when we stopped trying to maintain the fiction that everything was fine. She told me once, carefully, that Richard had said he felt blindsided. I said I thought he'd had 22 years of information to work with. She was quiet. Then she said, "You're right," and moved on. Progress, in families, often sounds exactly like that. Tyler texted me once, about a month after the wedding. The message said, "Hey, I heard things have been kind of tense. Hope you're okay. I appreciated it for what it was, which was a man doing the minimum because his conscience required it, not because he fully understood what he was reaching across. I texted back, I'm good. Thanks for checking. I am happy for you and Cassidy. I meant both of those things. In October, I hosted a small dinner at my apartment. Priya came, and Rosa, and a friend from school named Marcus, who teaches 5th grade and always brings wine that is slightly too nice for the occasion. I made pasta from scratch for the first time in years, something my grandmother taught me when I was 8, and it came out well, better than I expected. We sat at my kitchen table until midnight talking about books and students and bad first dates and the particular exhaustion of trying to change the world one third grader at a time. Nobody said anything important. Everything that was said mattered. Afterward, washing dishes with Priya while Rosa and Marcus argued pleasantly about something in the next room, I thought about the rehearsal dinner. The 11 minutes. The 11 minutes. The 11 minutes and the 7 photos and the little girl in the flower girl dress asking, "Who's that lady?" I thought about the Christmas gift card with the drugstore sticker, the post-op waiting rooms, the quiet college graduation I had walked through alone and called enough. I thought about my grandmother, who had written instructions so that I would have what I needed, and how those instructions had been set aside so quietly, so efficiently, as though they had never existed at all. And I thought, I spent 22 years trying to earn my way into a room that had already been locked from the inside. I kept knocking and adjusting and making myself easier to ignore, as though the problem was always my approach and never the door. What I know now is different. What I know now is that the people who benefit most from your patience are often the ones least likely to reward it. That silence is not the same as peace, and endurance is not the same as acceptance, and staying at a table that doesn't have a real seat for you is not the same as belonging. That you can love your mother completely and still refuse to keep performing normal in a family that normalized your erasure. That walking away from something is not always loss. Sometimes it is the first honest thing you have done in years. They called me a lot of things over the years, mostly by omission. The absence of my name in toasts, in photo albums, in phone calls that went out before they reached me. The absence of my face in frames on the wall, but ungrateful was the one that almost stuck, because it was the easiest way to reframe what I was, not someone who had been given less, but someone who is incapable of appreciating what she had. I am grateful, more than they ever knew, and for different things than they imagined. I am grateful for my 3rd graders, who look at me like I hung the moon on Monday mornings. I am grateful for Priya and Rosa and the pasta my grandmother taught me to make, and the specific quality of Arizona light in October. I am grateful for my aunt, who finally said out loud what she knew, and for my mother, who is trying in the ways she can, and for the version of me that kept every birthday card and every document and every quiet piece of evidence, not for revenge, but because I needed to know that what I remembered was real. I am grateful that I finally stopped adjusting my expectations downward and started building something at my own level instead. I am grateful most of all that the silence in my apartment on a Sunday evening no longer feels like absence. It feels like mine. If any part of this story landed somewhere close to home, if you have ever sat at a table where you were present but somehow not counted, if you have ever performed belonging you were never actually offered, I want you to know that recognizing it is enough to start with. You don't need a dramatic exit or a perfect confrontation or a resolution that wraps cleanly. You just need to stop pretending the door isn't locked and start building something that actually has room for you. Drop a 1 in the comments if you've been there, or tell me where you're watching from. I read everything, and I mean that. If this story didn't connect with you, tell me why. I want to understand. And if you're still here, if you made it all the way to this part, thank you. Take care of yourself the way you deserve to be taken care of all along. There's something I've come to understand about the way erasure works inside a family. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with cruelty or raised voices or a single moment you can point to and say, that was it, that was the thing that changed everything. It arrives slowly, in accumulation. A name left out of a toast, a photo cropped just slightly too close to the edge, a college fund redirected without a conversation, a door that gets opened for everyone in the room except you, so quietly and so consistently that after a while you start to wonder if the problem is the way you knock. For 22 years I knocked differently. I adjusted. I made myself easier to overlook in the hope that somewhere in the adjustment, I would finally fit. That is not weakness. I want to be clear about that. What I did required enormous energy and a kind of stubborn, quiet courage that I didn't have a name for at the time. But it was energy directed at the wrong wall. You cannot earn your way into a space that was never designed to hold you. That is not a failure of effort. That is a failure of architecture. And the moment I understood the difference, something in me became very still and very free. What Dana's story shows, what I lived, is that the consequences of how we treat people do not disappear simply because we stop paying attention to them. Every choice has a downstream. Every silence costs something. Richard spent 22 years building a family portrait with a deliberate gap in it, and he built it so carefully, so confidently, that he seemed to genuinely believe the gap would never speak. That is the specific blindness of people who have never been made to account for the small, ongoing harms. They mistake the other person's endurance for acceptance. They confuse your patience with permission. The intelligence I had to develop to survive that household was real. Watching, reading rooms, understanding the difference between what people say and what they mean, holding evidence not for revenge but for sanity. Those are not small things. That kind of perception, sharpened by years of needing it to navigate, became the foundation of every good thing I built outside that house. The classroom where I teach. The friendships that held when I finally let them. The clarity I found when I stopped performing belonging and started choosing it. What I know about integrity now is this: it does not require an audience. I did not send that email to Richard because I wanted the family to watch. I sent it because I had spent too long allowing his version of the story to be the only one in the room. Integrity is what happens when you decide that the truth deserves to exist even when acknowledging it costs you something. It always costs you something. That cost is not a sign you were wrong. It is a sign the thing was real. And resilience, the kind worth having, is not the ability to absorb unlimited damage without complaint. It is the ability to look at what happened clearly, name it honestly, grieve what needs grieving, and then redirect, not toward bitterness, toward something that actually has room for you. The dinner I made with my own hands at my own table with people who asked questions and waited for the answers. That was not a consolation prize. That was the point. That was always the point. If you're holding a version of this story in your own life, the chronic overlooking, the redirected resources, the exhausting performance of gratitude for things that were never actually given, I want you to hear this. Recognizing the pattern is not disloyalty. It is the beginning of honesty. And honesty, even when it is painful, and even when it costs you the comfort of pretending, is the only foundation solid enough to build anything real on. The silence I live in now is mine. That took everything I had to earn, and it was worth every single step.